In a park median in Paducah, Kentucky, there is a marble statue of a Chickasaw chief. His name was Paduke. The city is named for him. Schoolchildren here learned his story for generations. The friendly chief who lived at the mouth of the Tennessee River, who welcomed the settlers, who gave the town its name. The state historical markers still tell his story today. There is just one problem. The historians who study the Chickasaw say there was never any chief named Paduke. There was never any tribe by that name. The man on the pedestal never existed. And we know exactly how he got there. In 1909, the sculptor who made the statue told a Paducah newspaper where he learned about Chief Paduke. He heard it from the schoolchildren. The children told the artist the legend, and the artist carved the legend in marble, and the marble made it true. That is how this city remembers, and that is the story of Paducah, a town that has reinvented itself so many times that even its founding is an invention. Welcome to Dark History of Western Kentucky, where we dig up the stories that happened right here, in the counties most of the country just drives past. Today, Part 1 of the story of Paducah, $5, 2 rivers, 1 invented chief, and the flood that nearly ended everything. The story Paducah tells about its founding fits on a roadside marker, and the marker says this. In 1827, General William Clark, the Clark of Lewis and Clark, bought 37,000 acres of land here for $5. It was an estate deal. His brother, George Rogers Clark, had claimed this ground back in 1795, which is worth pausing on, because in 1795 this was still Chickasaw land, and it stayed Chickasaw land until 1818, when Andrew Jackson bought the whole western tip of Kentucky in what became known as the Jackson Purchase. The Clarks claimed it 23 years before the people who lived here ever agreed to sell. William Clark drew up a street grid, renamed the little settlement of Pekin after the Paducah, a nation he had heard of out west, and Paducah was born. What Clark actually bought for his $5 was geography. Paducah sits where the Tennessee River empties into the Ohio, 50 miles above the Mississippi, 20 miles below the Cumberland. 4 rivers, 1 town. When the steamboat arrived, that junction turned into money, because a steamboat could go upstream, and suddenly everything moving between New Orleans and Pittsburgh, between the cotton South and the grain Midwest, passed Paducah's front porch. By 1850, the town had a dry dock, a boatyard, a bank, and a foundry. By 1856, it was chartered as a city. It was on its way to becoming the second busiest river town in Kentucky. Then the war came up the river. Paducah was so pro-Confederate that people called it the Charleston of Kentucky. In September of 1861, the town hung Confederate flags and waited for the Southern Army that was marching up from Columbus. On the morning of September 6th, boats did arrive at the foot of Broadway. They were Union gunboats. The general who stepped off was an unknown brigadier named Ulysses S. Grant. He took the city without firing a shot, and he posted a proclamation that began, "I have come among you not as an enemy, but as your fellow citizen." It was one of the first things Grant ever did in this war. The army built a fort at the edge of town, Fort Anderson, with cannons pointed at the river. Paducah would spend the whole war occupied, a Confederate town held by the Union, and it was about to become the stage for one of the ugliest orders in American military history. In December of 1862, Grant issued General Order No. 11. It expelled, quote, the Jews, as a class, from his entire military department. In most places, the order was barely enforced. In Paducah, it was enforced completely. Around 30 Jewish families, merchants, shopkeepers, people who had lived here for years, were given 24 hours to leave. They shuttered their homes and their stores and were put on a river steamer. One of them was a merchant named Caesar Caskell, and Caesar Caskell did not go quietly. He fired off a telegram to Abraham Lincoln calling the order the grossest violation of the Constitution. Then he got on a train. 6 days after being expelled from his home, this Paducah shopkeeper was standing in the White House in front of Lincoln himself. Lincoln had never seen the order. He revoked it on the spot. The most notorious anti-Semitic act in American military history started in Paducah, and a Paducah man killed it. The war came back one more time. In March of 1864, Nathan Bedford Forrest raided Paducah with nearly 3,000 cavalry. The Union garrison fell back into Fort Anderson and refused to surrender. Among the men holding that fort were soldiers of the 8th United States Colored Heavy Artillery, formerly enslaved men from this county, in uniform, fighting Forrest's cavalry 2 weeks before Fort Pillow. A Confederate colonel named Albert Thompson led a charge against the fort and was killed by a cannonball. Albert Thompson was from Paducah. He died attacking his own hometown. The raiders burned warehouses, the depot, a steamboat, and dozens of homes. Then the Union defenders burned more homes the raiders had used for cover. And after it was over, the Army leveled most of an entire neighborhood so no raider could ever hide in it again. Paducah was burned twice in one battle, once by each side. Hold that thought about the neighborhood they flattened. It is called Lower Town, and it comes back at the end of this story. Which brings us back to the statues. In May of 1909, in a single week, Paducah unveiled 2 monuments. On a Saturday, a bronze of Lloyd Tillman, the Confederate general who lived here, paid for by his sons and the daughters of the Confederacy, while a picture of Robert E. Lee hung at the market house and a band played Dixie. 4 days later, the Chief Paduke statue, the friendly chief the schoolchildren believed in. Think about what that week was. A town that had flown Confederate flags and been taken by Grant, choosing its memories, in marble and bronze, 45 years after the fact. A general who lost his fort and a chief who never lived. Neither statue tells you what actually happened here. Both tell you what Paducah wanted to remember. Because what actually happened next was money. By the early 1900s, Paducah was, by its own count, the second largest manufacturing city in Kentucky. The writer Irvin Cobb, Paducah's most famous son, remembered the riverfront of his boyhood as wharf boats bulging with cotton in bales, tobacco in hogsheads, peanuts in sacks, whiskey in barrels. 3 distilleries ran here before Prohibition. And then there was the railroad. In the 1920s, the Illinois Central built its largest locomotive shop in the entire system at Paducah, and to do it, the city filled a ravine with 44,000 carloads of dirt. Paducah literally regraded the earth for that railroad. The shops became the 4th largest industrial plant in Kentucky, the biggest payroll in town, and during the Second World War, the men here did not just repair locomotives. They built 20 of them from scratch. The wealthy built their mansions in Lower Town, the neighborhood the Army had once flattened, reborn as the finest streets in the city. There was a second Paducah, a black Paducah, and it built too. In 1909, the same year as the statues, a widow named Maggie Steed opened the Hotel Metropolitan, the first hotel in the city owned and operated by African Americans. Louis Armstrong stayed there. So did Ike and Tina Turner. And Armstrong owed Paducah more than a room, because the band leader who discovered him on the riverboats, Fate Marable, the king of riverboat jazz, was a Paducah man. But the second Paducah lived under the first one's rules, and sometimes under its rope. In October of 1916, a mob lynched a black man named Brack Kinley. The same day, the same mob hanged a second man, Luther Durrett. His offense, as the record states it, was criticizing the mob. In this town you could be lynched for objecting to a lynching. That happened here, and it belongs in the story next to the statues and the mansions, because it is the part nobody cast in bronze. Then the river, the thing that made all of it, tried to take all of it back. Paducah had flooded before. 1884 and 1913 both crested at 54 feet, and people called those the worst floods that could ever happen. In January of 1937, after 18 inches of rain in 16 days, the Ohio came up more than 60 feet, 6 feet beyond anything ever recorded. The city's own historians say 9 of every 10 blocks went underwater. 27,000 people, nearly the whole city, fled or were driven to high ground for almost 3 weeks. The great railroad shops drowned. Every machine in the plant had to be taken apart and rebuilt. Ice floated down Broadway. The town that Two Rivers built had nearly been erased by one of them. So Paducah did the only thing left. It walled out its own river. Starting in 1939, the Army Corps of Engineers wrapped the city in 12 miles of levee and concrete, 14 feet high through downtown, built to hold the 1937 flood plus 3 more feet. It took 10 years. When it was finished, in 1949, Paducah was safe and cut off from the river that had been its whole reason for existing. The wharf boats were gone. The steamboats were gone. The town sat behind its wall and wondered what it was now. It would not wonder long, because 1 year later, in the winter of 1950, the federal government came back to Paducah with an offer. It arrived with a headline, a secret, and more money than this city had ever seen. That is Part 2, Atomic City.